Okay. All right, I'm going to screw my head on properly. Now, we are here tonight to talk about the conflicting land use buffers in the Unified Development Code. Big picture, we'd like to propose some amendments, but then we have a piece that we haven't proposed yet, and we'd like to have a little discussion about that because we'll need to help fleshing out the direction, if any, that those should go. Got it? Yeah. The course of the meeting will go, I'll do my introduction. We'll go over the issues and the proposed amendments, but then discuss we have some discussion questions. They were alluded to in the memo, but we sort of rephrased them to help with the flow of the conversation today. Again, in the landscaping section of the UDC, which is 520, there's a part about conflicting land use buffers. And there are 5 situations where they are required, and they're just listed verbatim here on the slide and in the memo. They address a vehicular use area when it's adjacent to a park or land used or zoned for residential. When a refuse recycling container is adjacent to a park or land principally used or zoned for residential. They also require the portion of the parcel that's zoned office, RE, ORL, any of the Cs for commercial, or any of the Ms for manufacturing, when those abut parks or parcels used or zoned residential. A conflicting land use buffer is required for the portion of a parcel zoned R3 or R4, which are multifamily districts, adjacent to a parcel used or zoned for residential. And finally, a portion of the TC parcel abutting a residential district or the PL district. There we go. There are actually 3, but divided. There are 2 big concerns with the way these are written now. The first is the applicability can change over time, and it's outside of the subject property's control. By linking applicability to the use of a property next door outside of its zoning designation, that use can change over time, and that is outside of a site's control. So if the use was vacant, maybe next door, no conflicting land use buffer is required. Then any residential is required, or then any residential is developed, and then the buffer is required. This site would be considered a non-conforming use. Now, the definition of non-conforming is you complied at the time, and through no fault of your own, it's now not conforming. But that's a tough spot to be in, to have something like that outside of your control. Another issue is whether we intended to or not, we are buffering identical uses from each other. So we are proposing some, and then here I'm going to set up a situation. And here, my classic horrendous diagrams, but I think I'm getting my point across. We've got 4 typical lots in an R4C district. Each is 60 feet wide because that's the minimum lot size. And there's 6 lines on my piece of paper. R4C requires a 25-foot front setback, 12 feet on each side, and 30 feet in the rear. We typically see on a block such as this, it's either a converted single-family home on the site, meaning it was originally a single-family home and now it may have a couple of apartments within it, or it's a new building with 4 apartments inside that single, like a 4-plex, and it probably has a driveway leading to a small parking area or a full parking lot in the rear. With our current requirements, and again, this is citywide, this applies any zoning district at all, but the concerns really show up and are highlighted and are most impactful in the R4C district, in our, what I'll call our urban residential neighborhoods. And here, those same lots they are required to have a conflicting land use buffer because R4C must buffer from R4C. So they'll need a conflicting land use buffer, which I've shown in bad green hatching. And the buffer is 15 feet wide all the way around. So that means if you combine both buffers on both sites, it's 30 feet separation. And unlike a side setback or rear, where you could put some things, you can put a sidewalk pathway, you could put a driveway, you could have your side yard be lawn or grass. You could have a patio, things. You can't do anything in a conflicting land use buffer. It's a buffer. So this is forcing 30 buildings to be 30 feet apart. We already have generous setbacks, side setbacks of 12 feet each side, that's 24. But on top of that, it's 30 feet. And then if you want anything else, you're going to have to push the width of your site out or drop those things from your plan. So our proposed amendments are kind of I was describing it, I don't know if it's accurate, but I'm describing it as sort of a surgical strike. These are not particularly difficult to do. As you can see, it's pretty minimally invasive, but it'll have a big impact. If in line 3, we strike the word principally used or, then we will not be required to, then each lot will be in control of its own destiny. The portion of a parcel that is abutting residential zoning will require a conflicting land use buffer. But if you are in an O district and developed as some sort of residential, and you are adjacent to another O district that is developed with residential, you don't need to buffer those two residential uses. We are striving to emphasize the conflicting part and not the current part, if you will. And in line 5 of the code, if we strike the principally used or, and then switch for residential purposes, if we insert R1, that will then require conflicting land use buffers from our higher density, our multifamily districts, from our lower density R1. There are but a few spots, I think, around town where that happens. Just made a mental note to maybe map that out. But this will then eliminate the need to buffer like from like. We will not need to buffer R4C from R4C. I think this was the intent originally, was to buffer some larger multifamily developments from established single family neighborhoods. I don't think it was intended for a buffer on a small lot right down the block. I don't think so. And I feel like this is a fix. And as you can see, it doesn't take much to achieve a big change. But the third thing is, oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. The third thing is really like, I think this is the meat of tonight's discussion. And I'd be happy to circle back and talk about these things. But I think the meat of the discussion is, in looking at this, the clubs for conflicting land use buffer doesn't address scale or context of the neighborhood. It's the same conflicting land use buffer is required in all situations for all reasons, no matter any type of context. And this issue would not be so simple to address. It's not just, oh, strike this 2 words and we're going to achieve something else. It's almost like we should be writing a parallel conflicting land use buffer, or have versions of them, maybe a light buffer in some cases or something, but we'll need a lot more writing to accomplish this. It's not a bad thing, it just needs discussion. So doing what we plan to do, making those 2 amendments that I just spoke about, if we strike the conflicting land use buffer from and focus on conflicting zoning districts and the vehicular use areas or the refuse screening, then we are left with vehicular use areas. Those same lots in our R4C visualization example, they'll still require a conflicting land use buffer in the rear for their parking lot. And so I've mapped out the situation. You'll see that the buffer is not required between the buildings, but we've got it towards the back of the property. Wrong wrong forward. And then you'll see here, we've got some live examples of a conflicting land use buffer for an entire parcel. This is between 133 and 143 Hill Street. And I'm pointing here to our conflicting land use buffer that's between the two properties. 133 Hill Street, it doesn't also have a buffer. It was, I think, a little bit prior to the ordinance change. 133 Hill was, I think, in 2007. But 143 Hill was just a couple years ago. And you can see it in action. And to me, this doesn't really say this is an urban neighborhood. This is a near downtown neighborhood. So the discussion for us to really get into is, why are we buffering parking areas and what are we buffering against? Is it we don't want to see the parking? Is it we're trying to, is it somehow related to smell or sounds? Like, why do we even have conflicting land use buffers in the first place? And are all parking lots the same? Do we need to treat every one of them the same? Is a small parking lot in an urban residential neighborhood truly a conflicting land use? Is it so terrible that we've got to insulate it and really contain it? Are we perhaps using clubs as a proxy for something else? We should have more setback in some way, but we're using clubs to sort of achieve that? Or do we want more open space on the lot? And so we're going to require a conflicting land use buffer, but what we really want is something else. Are we trying to restrict parking, to make parking so onerous that it's got all these extra requirements? And then also, do the conflicting land use buffers prevent other like wanted things in our neighborhood? Everything takes space. The building takes space on the lot. The parking lot takes space. The front yard takes space. If you have to provide something, are you sacrificing something else for it? And what would even happen if there was no club requirement? What would that look like? Would we get more density? Would we get, I don't know, but these are the things I'm interested in hearing about so that we can try to identify if we need to make further changes. To get a level playing field for the discussion, a vehicular use area is defined as 1,200 square feet used for parking, not including the square footage of the driveway. So a lesser size does not qualify as a capital vehicular use area. A parking space is 9 by 18 feet, and it takes up about 162 square feet. So I think that there is about like somewhere in the 5, 6, 7 parking spaces, then sort of triggers a vehicular use area because you need some maneuvering room as well. Most driveways are required to be 18 feet wide. The only exception is in a single family zoning district, that driveway is 12 feet. And a conflicting land use buffer by code has 3 components. It has a width of 15 feet. It requires plantings for 1 tree for every 15 feet of linear length. And it requires a continuous screen, whether it be a 4-foot hedge, 4-foot berm, 4-foot wall, or 4-foot fence, or a combination thereof. Another fact is, well, at least in my mind, when I say urban neighborhoods, I'm talking about R1C, R1D, R2A, and R4C. Those are the neighborhoods you'll find in the center of our city. You'll find them everywhere as well, but if you look at a map, we do have a fairly decent donut model, if you will, of downtown with D1 and D2 in the center, and the residential neighborhoods surrounding are one of those 4. Parking is not permitted. It says flat out in the code that parking is not permitted in the front yards, but that means it is allowed in the side or rear yards. Nothing is allowed in a conflicting land use buffer. And vehicular use areas are generally not seen in R1C, R1D, or R2A. Those are pretty much 1 dwelling unit per lot, and not many people need or require or desire more than, say, 2 or 3 paved area for more than 2 or 3 surface parking spaces. People have garages and so forth, and those don't count as vehicular use area. So even though those are sort of our urban neighborhoods, when you're talking about conflicting land use buffers on small parking lots in our urban, we're only talking about R4C, because those are the places what might have 4 dwelling units on the lot, and they might want 4 or 6 spaces for surface parking. And then finally, my last bit of terrible drawing, but when we are talking about the smallest R4C lots, just 60 feet wide, minimum size, and you have a small parking lot, vehicular use area in the back, that club is going to be about 25% of the property. Just, you know, that's a pretty significant percentage to be devoting to one thing. That's not the principal use, which is the dwelling. So here's the open-ended sort of questions. Should we, and I should say this, yes, conflicting land use buffers are required for other situations than vehicular use areas, but I'm not as concerned. I think they are different animals. I'm trying to lay the case. When you've got a conflicting land use buffer around a very large parking lot, or around a shopping center or something else, you know, that's not the land hog, and that doesn't define the character as much as these small parking lots in the dense urban or in the dense residential districts. So we'll sort of limit the discussion to talking about small parking lots and the conflicting land use buffer impacts. So do you think we should treat vehicular use areas for 5 cars the same as what's required to buffer a 50 or 500 car parking lot? And where is the line then between small parking lots or large? And could we could one of the conflicting land use buffers be less or none of that element and still get the job done if it's needed? Could the width be reduced? Could there be fewer plantings? No restrictions on tree type. Remember, in conflicting land use buffer, half of the trees need to be evergreen. Could there be less screening? Does it have to be 4 feet high? Are all those choices appropriate? Should some be removed? But those are the kind of, that's the kind of thing. So before taking on this effort, do you see an issue? And maybe what are the fundamental problems of it, so that we can define the problem so that we can craft a solution? Hank, did I miss anything? I probably did.
I think that's a great place to end our discussion. You ended exactly where I'll put my little 2-bit in here. When Alexis and I were talking about this and preparing the presentation, the thing I kept going back to is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Right now we're discussing fixing the conflicting land use buffer that created unintended consequences. And so if we're going to clean up one thing, what else can we clean up? Because for everything that we require, there are unintended consequences. It's just, do the intended, outcomes outweigh whatever those things that we can't see are? And so if we're going to require something, I just urge us to think about why we're requiring it and being really clear on whether or not our solution matches the issue identification.
Great, thank you. Who wants to kick off our discussion? Hi, yeah, go ahead, Commissioner Mills.
So I am in an R4C district. So this is my frame that I come at this. Our immediate neighbor has a vehicular use area right along the property line, on the property line, lights into the living room regularly. That doesn't bother me. I chose to live downtown. Like, I should be real clear about, like, I know that that comes along with downtown living. So I really welcome the idea that, like, not screening like uses from each other, like that just doesn't make sense. This is a wiser use of space. On the vehicular use area side though, like, and the reason that I think that this is a good one to talk about is because if that, right now, we've already done the work of reducing parking minimums. And so there is no, so it is a landowner's choice to put in a vehicular use area, which often is a vehicular storage area. Particularly if we're talking about the downtown areas. And that's not the wisest use of space. And so I'm trying to think about one approach to minimizing parking is to pass a maximum, right? Like that's one way to disincentivize, and not just disincentivize, but like force them not to be allowed to build more parking or additional parking. I mean, the other way is to say, hey, you need to have something in exchange, like make it more expensive, make you think twice before adding an additional spot into your parking area. And I think that is one of the things that I see the current club, if it, kind of, again, thinking through only having it around the vehicular use areas, I'm thinking that actually, in absence of parking maximums, serves as the like additional price put on choosing to offer parking. I can make the case that it is trading something that we think is not necessarily an environmental good, car storage, for something that could be an additional benefit, particularly that it's not just open space. I don't love, honestly, our open space, like open space for open space purpose, but that it is vegetated. So in my mind, like a fence, which actually could take up less space, I wouldn't want to go to that approach, even if because again, I'm not worried about the light pollution so much as the environmental benefits potentially of forcing some additional tree mass, because I guess grass is vegetation. I don't want, like, maybe I'm also bad, like that I'm a not lover of grass. So like, so that's how I'm thinking about this. And again, to your point, Mixed Kelly, I think like my reaction about like what it's intended to do or what it's solving is more like minimizing how much car storage we have, especially when we're talking about new construction, like not building new parking lots that are above and beyond. But there's a different tool that you could use to get there too. And so to the point that you made, Ms. Salio, about like what is large and what is small, like I like that approach for something that it has and maybe this is mixing the two together, a small parking lot tied to the side, like, and I think I would define this as like a multiple of the units. So like not more than, if it's not more than one spot per unit, then I would say if that's kind of the maximum that we would set, then that doesn't need to be, that doesn't need the conflicting land use buffer for that vehicular area. But I think if you exceed, have a bigger than necessary car storage area, then I see that as the kind of penalty that you could pay. And so so I wouldn't say it's 5 versus 50. It's kind of how big is that building? Because five spaces in a building with 3 units is more than 5 spaces in a building with 15 units. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about this. But but that's poorly formed, and I don't know if that triggers any other thoughts
No, but
or reactions.
I think your goal though is clear, like, you know, I think your bottom line is clear. Don't worry about that.
Okay.
Commissioner Hammerschmidt, did you want to chime in? Yeah.
I mean, that was a completely different way of thinking about it than I'd been thinking about it. That's really interesting. Because I've been sitting here, like I read the memo and during this presentation, and I've never really understood these clubs like at all. And it kind of sounds like there's a lot of components of it that maybe like don't make sense, which is why we're looking at this right now. It does feel like messy to use the club as a way to like try to maximize parking though, like to your point, Commissioner Mills. So like, I mean, but then we would need parking maximums. But I guess like, I don't know, for me, it like, I thought Alexis, like your points were really good. Like we're taking away potentially developable space or usable outdoor space for like, what are we buffering? Like, why are we buffering? What are we buffering against? Like, are cars that offensive to look at that like we're making people take away a lot of their property to put in some trees? Not that trees are bad, but I mean, I think it's a good question, right? So now I don't have fully formed thoughts either, because like, Sarah, I think you just like kind of threw a wrench in this, because it's like, well, maybe, I don't know. I don't really have good thoughts. I like your first proposals. Like, I think that cleans everything up. Well, here's one question. Have we looked at what other cities are doing? Like, do other cities do conflicting land use buffers?
I did not do a super in-depth research on this, but we did a little bit high level looking for, and take this with a big grain of salt, but the trend seems to be you won't find conflicting land use buffer in other codes. And I think that is because other codes have more robust, for lack of better explanation, like performance standards or use specific standards. And I think they tie them not to they don't do it this way. I think they say, when you have a car dealership, it needs to have it needs to have this kind of landscaping around it. And so they tie it like very specific, like, so they do buffering that way. It's pretty common to have more general landscape requirements than we do. So they require more landscaping on their sites, particularly suburban communities with a lot of subdivisions or a lot of like shopping centers. You know, they've got a lot of design standards.
Mm-hmm.
I think that other communities too, you require the landscaping in parking lots, then they require some right-of-way screening. But I did not actually find many. And if anything, they just call it landscape buffer. They don't call it conflicting land use buffer. So doesn't seem like there's a big robust body out there to do it. And I don't find, and I think we have the smallest threshold for the conflicting land use buffers around, like, say, parking lots. I don't think that many communities, and I really don't think that urban communities, like Mix Kelly talked about, maybe like Royal Oak, Ferndale, it's accepted that the backyard is full of parking in a tight neighborhood, and maybe there's a fence around it, and that's all you get.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ellie, I don't know, Ellie, you want to have some thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, no, I just didn't want to interrupt.
No, you're
I had a similar thought as Commissioner Mills, but I also think it's that if we want to reduce parking, we should just go for parking maximums. So maybe just as in principle, maybe I'm a little bit uncomfortable with as a practice, I guess, of like using this to achieve that. But I think, I guess maybe one question I have is like, what are the other things that regulate the rear yard? So like, there's not, is it there's not an open space requirement in our districts, right? In R4C or.
Let me double check.
Okay. I'm just wondering, like, could you pave the entire rear yard if you dealt with the stormwater?
That I do know, you can.
Yeah, many people, Alexis and I were talking about this, Planner DeLeo and I were talking about this, and you know, one thing that I'll just throw this out there while you're still noodling on this, because you know, we maybe had some benefit putting together the presentation this evening, is just backyards can change over time. This is not necessarily a permanent arrangement, but the club requirement in relation to what we require would be. So if we make it more flexible, we allow for that space to change. When I think about behavioral shift in transportation, which was you know, my entire planning career, something that I think about a lot. Behavioral shift is going to happen when we have excellent other options. That means that the ride service is increasing, that we make it really wonderful to walk, that we make more active uses fit on less land, and reducing our buffers allows us, it starts to move us toward that. So enabling mixed use, these types of things incentivize people to walk and give up their cars. Trends show that younger generations don't want to have cars. They're expensive. And if you are in a place that meets your needs, then you don't need it. And this is, I think, as the ORC members know best, the regulations can change and they can be flexible. So if there's something that it's not right to change, like maybe you want to wait until you do take on a conversation about parking maximums, you could. I mean, there's so many different ways that this could go, but it doesn't have to feel permanent. And so I think this is just like I really like this this subcommittee because it's a great exploratory space to just think about all of these things. Maybe that gives people some mental buffer, little yardage of mental buffer to noodle. But I really think about behavioral shift a lot when we're talking about the parking standards, because as regulators, we're influencing the market. We're either developers might charge more per unit and they just sell a more limited number of spaces to at a higher price, because instead of 5, they have 4. Because we have a buffer and now we feel really great because we have evergreens. Like, just trying to boil down, how are we as regulators influencing these different things that are going to filter down into the market? Because I've seen it, as a renter now and in the past. It doesn't necessarily mean that less people drive. It's just some people pay more for the convenience, and then the rest of the people park around the block because they may not give up their vehicle until they have really convenient ways to get around and all of those amenities near them, which we're working very earnestly to do through encouraging mixed use districts, through trying to make TC1 work and all of these different things. But I'm not personally convinced that by using clubs to as a proxy for parking maximums is the right tool.
Well, maybe it would be useful to talk about the club outside of an idea about parking, and just also think about the other questions on the table, which are, what are we buffering? And if we want to produce a buffer, what are the minimum requirements to do so? Does it need to be 15 feet? Does it need to be continuously screened, et cetera? But I think I guess I am just like taking note of the fact that I think what I'm hearing is that in R4C, it's the one thing that prevents the entire rear yard from being paved currently. Is that accurate, Alexis?
I'm not sure if it's the one thing, because, but we do, nowhere, I guess in point of fact, your entire side yard and front yard could be paved as well. Now, you cannot use it for parking. But if your surface material of choice is, you name it, is gravel, mulch, brick pavers, concrete, asphalt, it's permitted. You'll have to deal with that consequences, and you'll have to provide stormwater management you have to provide stormwater management, drainage. But if your material, or if your ground cover of choice is concrete, you can do that now. And again, we limit, and if you want to do that in your backyard, you're going to have to somehow further define your parking area. And then we'll apply whatever appropriate parking standards or conflicting land use buffers are required. But you can still have a larger paved area than parking lot, and with a conflicting land use buffer.
Okay. Well, maybe just a few easier things that we could bite off to start. I mean, I think so. I think we would all agree that the amendments to the first two amendments that you put on the table that strike use from the code language, I think make a lot of sense. Sarah, does that sound right to you? Okay, and then let's take up this question about whether how conflicting is the conflicting land use between R3 or 4 and R1. So that gets at the question of what is it that we're buffering from? I don't think it's not noise. I mean, hedges don't buffer noise.
It's views, right?
It's view.
Like,
it's view.
I own a single family house. I don't want to look at a small parking lot. That to me doesn't feel like I don't know, like it doesn't seem like I don't know. I don't see why we would need to buffer like a residential from a residential.
It was obviously important to many at one time.
Sure.
But I think, as behavioral norms and expectations shift, we can revisit.
I mean, I think even like I live in a single family neighborhood. Like I mean, people 2 houses down from me have like a huge like camper in there. It's just like I don't care. Like there's cars, there's kids, there's whatever. There's just stuff. It's just how people live. Like I don't need to be screened from every little thing.
Well, and R1 to R1, somebody can have their driveway along the side yard and then park in the rear, right up against your lot line. And if you don't like that, you can put up a fence. And that option is still available to anybody, I guess, in this case. Yeah.
Why do we need to take away like extra footage? Trees are nice again, but I don't know. It feels exclusionary to me.
And again, I don't usually speak for the trees. I'm like, I think that this is the better tool here is parking maximums, because I feel like all of this would be taken away if we had a parking maximum.
It's on our work plan, right? Somewhere.
It is.
Like, let me say, like, I was confident that this committee would agree to the first points about amendments, but it was this: do we go further and tinker with and make levels or thresholds with conflicting? And honestly, if the answer is this is actually bigger and this should be part of a bigger overhaul, that is absolutely fine. I have no hidden agenda. If it's no, like, the buffer is not the problem here, we need to tackle parking maximums. And just for discussion purposes, maybe the problem is, well, because something in my mind was, if you're, it doesn't seem to me there's a disconnect. There doesn't seem to be if you put cars in your backyard, park a few cars in your backyard, well, then you definitely need some trees. Well, then why don't you always need some trees? Like, and if it's to screen something, well, like, if the purpose is that your view out of your kitchen window in the back needs to be better, well, then everyone, so is the answer actually more universal landscape requirements, or is the answer, is the problem that everyone needs to have a little bit of unpaved area? Well, then we should maybe not permit development in the rear setback or something like that. And if that's the conclusion, like this is a bigger deal or this is not the right tool, then absolutely, that's what I was looking for, this input to say, you know, don't touch anything, make this part of a different discussion for a future thing. Saying it's all okay.
Thank you for the reassurance. Appreciated.
The point that someone could always choose to put up a fence on their own property is a good point. And we have greater permissibility for opacity in backyards. Your fences can be higher. There's someone on our team who looks at this almost every single day for compliance and for new fence designs. So but if people want to be able to see their neighbors and they want that casual interaction, then having an evergreen in between you and your neighbor might not be what you want.
I have a question that related to that. Actually, this is something that, because parking is allowed on the side yard, can you put up a fence? Because I feel like the opacity changes, like it can't be super opaque in the front. So can we imagine a situation that would actually, if somebody does put up a parking lot in their side yard, this is legit my neighbor. They park into like sometimes into our driveway, not just like facing into our house. Does the fence requirements allow for that? Because I think that again, now we're just making this bigger.
You're asking, can you screen parking if the parking is on the side of the house? Like on a
If the
corner
parking
home?
is on the side, right? Because, and I'm with you, I'm totally with you that like, if you don't like what your neighbor's doing, put up a fence. And the point that you just made was in the back, they're like, you can have an opaque privacy fence, but I don't think that you can, there's a point on the side where you can't, and that's not fully opaque. And I'm just not sure what that regulation is. And maybe it's like, you can have it opaque up to chest height and then the top part, I just don't know what that is.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
Also, I never answered for our first seed district in particular, the open space requirement is 40%. And so a conflicting land use buffer can overlap, that it is not cumulative. The conflicting land use buffer contributes to the open space requirement of 40%.
And open space, but open space could be concrete.
No.
Or is open space is vegetated? Okay, so there is
Yes.
so you couldn't pave your entire rear yard. Okay.
Right.
Sidewalks,
Or you could do the
though,
rear and you could leave.
Yeah. Well, if your front yard is big enough,
Right.
and if your
Yeah.
front yard is big enough, your rear yard could be all paved.
and sidewalks and pathways are open space.
Yeah.
It's the parking area and the driveway that's not.
Yes.
Got it.
And then for fences, I see now there's a little bit of a loophole, but we will not be exploiting this. But in a residential district, the height and opacity is based on the building placement. In the front yard, which is between the front lot line and then the face of the building, make it straight if it's jog. And then there is and that's 50% opacity, 4 feet in height. In the side yard, so in the portion along the side of the building, however deep or shallow that is, 80% opacity, 6 feet in height. And then in the rear yard, so from the back wall of the building all the way back, that's 100% opacity, up to 8 feet high. Now, the loophole that we will not be exploiting is the conflicting land use buffer needs a 4 foot high solid wall or fence. So I guess that would override in the side yard the lower 4 feet of your 6-foot high fence can be solid to meet the conflicting land use buffer requirements. If you wanted an even taller fence, then the top 2 feet, because it can be up to 6 feet, can be 80% opacity. These don't jive too well together. Clearly, I did not write these because otherwise they will be totally internally consistent. But anyway, back to the, if you're just trying to screen your neighbor, you are limited to 80% opacity for your fence. You can do additional things like plantings on top, in addition to your fence to get that full light screening if you want. But in a normal situation, you're limited to 80% in your side yard.
Yeah.
Which is pretty opaque, actually, but.
Well, it'll cut down 80% of the light.
Well, and could it be like, you know, the things where it's solid on the bottom, lattice on the top, if the whole thing overall, I don't know
No,
how, like,
I just closed the book, but you measure it with like a 1 or a 2 foot square. So you can't have, 4 feet and 2 feet. That's outside of the, at any one point, it has to meet the 80% opacity.
okay.
And just to be clear, we're only talking about, we're only putting on the table a revision to land use buffers between residential uses.
Right.
We're not
Well,
talking about the buffer between, or we're not talking about the buffer between office or M or R and RE, sorry, and residential zone.
Right,
That would remain.
That would still be required. The part would be required is, don't look at the land use, look at the zoning designation. But when you have those zoning designations adjacent to something that starts with R, then the buffer is required.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that side thing, like, I mean, that was just for parking. I mean, I think that parking and driving are different. So I was thinking more the conversation before about like the parking area versus the drive area. Somebody's not going to be driving right at your house from the side, like constantly. It's the parking function. So I think that the first 2 things that you laid out made tons of sense. It's like those are very clear.
Yeah, I'm kind of getting the sense though, so tell me if I'm wrong, and we don't need to beat a dead horse. The changing the conflicting land, changing or introducing scaled conflicting land use buffers for what remains is not a simple solution. Probably needs to be wrapped up as part of a bigger discussion, and we probably should not tackle it as a standalone.
It does not sound simple.
Well, sorry, define, what do you mean by scaled? It's because I feel like what I'm hearing is an appetite to consider removing number 4 entirely. So that would be removing a requirement for a club between R3 or 4 and R1.
Okay.
Am I hearing that? That's what I thought I was hearing.
Which then I guess would take that scale and context question sort of like off the table.
No,
Right.
because
No, because we would still consider it for
a vehicular use area.
But vehicular use area, you're saying, is large enough that it probably doesn't apply all that often. I would think even in R4C, how often do you have, you were saying it has to be probably 5 or even 6 spaces, right? For a 4-unit building.
Yeah, I think you need to get over 4 spaces.
Over 4.
To be a vehicular use area.
Right.
So
I guess what I'm thinking is there's a simple version. There's a complex version. There's a simple version where we strike number 4, which is the R to R, R3, 4 to R1, leave in place number 1, which is specifically about vehicular use areas, with an understanding that very occasionally that will actually apply in R4C, but most of the time it won't apply in any of the R districts.
Right. What I was sort of going at was for number 1, vehicular use area adjacent to a park or land user zoned. Would we split that up and say a 15-foot wide and the rest? Conflicting land use buffer is required when a vehicular use area is more than 10 spaces. You need that. And then maybe when you have a vehicular use area that is the smallest size, 1,200 square feet up to 2,000, then do you require only a 4-foot fence? Doesn't need any setback, doesn't need any plantings. Or or like along those lines, do we parse it out and do we say like, or when your lot size is less than 8,000 square feet, your vehicular use area, the width is 7.5, you cut it in half, you cut everything in half, 7.5 feet. Do we introduce like context and require smaller buffers on smaller lots and or with smaller intensity with those small parking lots? Do they get something different?
Were you going to say something, Commissioner Mills? Yeah.
Well,
ahead.
yeah, I just think that that's better. That's like the rationale for that is really about limiting parking area. And I think that that's a parking maximum discussion. And so I would rather than split the hairs there, the change to number 1, I think taking out the or use, right? Like just residentially zoned, like that makes sense. Like don't do the or residential use. That's the residence in an office district, right? Or the residence in a D district, right? Some kind of like, no, like, let's just say, I would make that change, but rather than doing the scaling associated with that, I would not put my time or effort in that. To Commissioner Abrams' point though, if what we're talking about is in number 4 is your proposed change for number 4 was saying only require the screening when R4 or 3 are adjacent to R1. And again, if there's a parking lot, number 1 still is going to require the screening.
Yeah.
So this is just for the driveway, right?
Well, like this is for like the side yard, like the whole side line.
It's just for it has nothing to do with anything except for it's an R3 or 4 versus a 1.
And that's where I would just like, to our point before, there's not tons of places where they do happen. It's downtown. I mean, having that information for everybody else, I think would be useful, but like, if we can just cut that, like.
Yeah, I think we all agree on that. I do think that having some maps that show us where that occurs would be really helpful for the full commission to see. And also, I just would be interested to see some examples of new development in R4C, like how many spots they have. I'm just curious to know how often are they building more than 5 spots? How often are they meeting this vehicular use area criteria? Because if it's really, really rare, then I think we don't have to split hairs over it. But if it's actually more common than I think, then maybe we do want to address that.
Okay. There was one spot that I recalled off the top of my mind on the zoning map where we've got R1 against multifamily, and it helped me with the name. This is on Pontiac Trail, just north of Skydale. I'll zoom out a little bit. We've got Dubarn up here in the top, go down Pontiac Trail a little bit. And we have a single family neighborhood here. It's R1 something.
Is that North Sky?
It's not, I think this is North Sky.
Okay.
With the
R1D,
multiple zoning. but here is R4B, and here on Skydale is R1. You've got to search around the map though when you find, you don't often find where not a street is separating it. Here, Pontiac Trail itself is separating an R4 from an R1. But just there's one, and so this doesn't have a surface parking lot, but it requires a buffer along this south side and the north side, because there's some R1D there as well. And there's a park that got added here a little bit. So that's where it would have to provide one if this was coming in fresh.
So there's already setbacks, right? So we're just adding like a few more feet and trees.
We may or may not be adding a few more feet, depending. If it's a side setback, maybe adding some more feet. If it's a rear setback, the rear is deeper.
Mhm.
If there was no conflicting land use buffer, it could just be lawn or something. If it was a conflicting land use buffer, it has to have that screening and planting element as well.
I have another question.
So-
Do people like, did developers ever push back on this? Like, I know we've heard from a lot of developers recently that like, it's really hard to develop in Ann Arbor, and that's true. But is this anything, is this in particular something that you've heard from developers? Like,
Well, yes and no, not in that situation. I just stopped the screen share, but not these large developments. I think they were they don't sort of push it to the edge anyway. They've got so much land area to work with. I think they don't want to build directly on their lot line. I don't think they mind. It benefits them. I think they were just planning on landscaping as well. But it's the 8,500 square foot R4C lot on Hill Street. And I think every one of them has either a straight up variance. They're like, we cannot meet these. Our lot is only 60 feet wide or 66 feet wide. And if I have a 15-foot buffer on either side of it, I've just taken out 30 feet of my 60-foot buildable area. Or they have a landscape modification that we used to do. So it's those developers, they push back hard. Well, they don't push back in the sense it's a code requirement,
right.
but they seek variances, they seek landscape modifications. What we haven't seen is building garages, because you don't need if you put your parking in a garage, the garage doesn't need to be buffered. Well, no, they would have had, until we make these amendments, doesn't matter if you put it in a garage or not. That's why they're not putting it in a garage. It doesn't matter if you do a garage or not, because also you just simply need a buffer from your own building.
Right. I mean, that picture you showed on Hill Street, like what, I mean, like, what are those trees doing? Like, they're so small, like that building was like 3 stories. It's kind of like, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, they'll grow.
Well, right, but
Yes.
you know,
Yeah,
in like 20 years.
Yeah, well, you got to start somewhere. But yeah, I mean, they'll grow, but in my mind, the thing is like, that's not very urban character. You don't see many evergreen trees in the front or side yards in a downtown setting. So and I think that the purpose is that you want that solid hedge wall, and I don't think you do want to buffer neighbors from each other in that case. I just don't think that one apartment building is inherently a conflicting land use than the other, but we're taking care of that part.
But even like if that was a single family house, like
One thing sorry.
No, go ahead.
One thing that Alexis and we haven't brought this up with forestry, but is species variation. Are we impacting ability to have more species? If the goal were landscaping oriented, we just want more trees, we want more landscaping, and that's the purpose of the buffer. That's the purpose of the whatever, you could rebrand it, but right now it's club. then do we want to mandate evergreens? Also, you know, trees can impact foundations, and they can also impact your sunlight. It's just, these are just different things that when I really like, the thing that keeps me up at night is when we require things without having very, very firm reasons, and then they have unintended consequences that simply happen because we didn't think it through. And then people on the other side, our planners, are sitting on, you know, calls, and I'm listening in with petitioners and developers. And in this case, you know, these are like attainable redevelopment for people who don't have deep pockets. To redevelop an infill site, something like that, that's could be attainable for somebody who like gets a bank loan and goes in with some friends or family. When planners are on the line and when I hear it may not make sense, but it's the code and I have to enforce it, I mean, it just kills me inside. I hate hearing that. And I do have to hear it because we do require a lot of things that they don't always make sense. So I've heard some people on the planning commission say, okay, I just want to stress test this. And that's music to my ears. I think it is healthy for us to stress test some of these things and really get all of these thoughts and feelings out before someone else is on the receiving end of it. So the height requirement, the species, you know, it's not a species requirement, but not a big biology person, but you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I was actually just gonna add, like, this is maybe a dumb question, but like, are evergreens native? Like, I understand like evergreens because like they can act as that screen, but like, is that like, are there better species that could be used in these situations, like that would be better for like, you know, the environment here? So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. Well, that obviously I'd have to talk to someone like Tiffany Jacobazzi, but it does make sense to me. If your purpose of your buffer is to screen the view, then yeah, you're going to want to use evergreen because that's 24/7, 365.
When that goes back to your original question.
Yeah,
What's the purpose?
Yeah, but if your purpose is, well, we need space between buildings, like, well, we do have setbacks, or if your purpose is, well, we need landscaping for carbon sink. Okay, well then what's the best species for that? Or even just context, you know, like if the purpose is, well, we need some visual screening, but why do you need it against the building? We're taking care of that. But, or like, and where is the connection between solar access, even for, you know, windows, natural light, you know, like a lot of our zoning regulations are based in, you need natural light, we need, you know, sunlight and air circulation. That was the purpose of zoning. And now we're going to say, but cover that up. So providing that, what is the purpose, and are we making sure we're not shooting ourselves in the foot?
Going back to the example that you had on the screen earlier, that buffer is not a continuous screening. So I don't even think it's meeting those requirements. Like there's 3 trees, there's nothing else. But then I was just looking across the street, there's another new, I don't know if you have the ability to screen share and pull up Street View, but if you do, across the street, there's another new multifamily development that looks like it does have a buffer on one side and not on the other. Right, so that one is not continuous. I don't even think it meets the club requirements.
Well, I'm thinking it may meet it because I see the planting here and I see a planting here, and then this might be the hedge. This might be the continue. I know, I know.
But it's not opaque to 4 feet. And then, do you mind looking just across the street, right behind the camera?
Yeah, and this is this one received a variance because they said that this was, oh, I don't want to mess it up. They received a variance because this is a shared driveway, and they couldn't cut off the middle of the driveway because they had an easement to share it. So, but they had to get a variance for that. And they did, they got a variance, but you see here, they've got the fence, they've got the arborvitae plantings.
Right, which is just protecting another multifamily parking area from their own side yard. It's,
yes. Yeah, so,
Well,
Um,
I would be really interested to hear what the rest of our colleagues think, but I feel like the three of us, it seems like there's consensus among us
yeah. We did,
to
I
strike
don't want to
number
make,
4.
yeah, I don't want to make anyone get, car sick. But we also noticed this, that one, if you go around the corner of it,
Hmm.
so it's hard to see the completely land use buffer, comes between the two buildings here, and then it wraps around here.
Hmm.
But the guys are hanging out on the driveway. Because it's a little hard to hang out in a multi-planty area.
For
Looks like
what
they're
it's
seeking
worth,
some sun too.
I remember this proposal, like, this is not that old. And
No,
I'm pretty sure that this was commissioner proposed business to look at clubs.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Back to there,
Um,
because we had this conversation, like, it's right against another parking area. Like, does this make sense that we are screening these from each other?
yeah.
I'm glad
That's
that thank you for tackling this.
Yeah. Okay,
Thanks.
so, everyone likes short meetings, so I guess to sum up, let me pull up. Way too many windows. I apologize.
Do you want to pull up the slide, Alexis, that has the current requirements, and we can get consensus, and maybe
Yes.
also the slide where you had your proposed changes? I heard loud, it sounds like Commissioner Abrams and others are agreeing consensus to just strike the requirement for that buffers R4 and R3. Okay,
Yes.
so that I have clear. I just want to make sure there's clear takeaways on whatever else.
Yeah, I think the other thing there's consensus on is striking land principally used from number 1. So that would just
So
be,
it sounds like from here,
yep,
keep number 3 as proposed. Keep number 4, but maybe not number 4 as proposed, possibly just strike number 4.
strike number 4.
Okay.
And then in number 1, get rid of land principally used, right?
Yes, we were going to do that anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, and then I think, just so you know, then I think I might then combine 5 and 3. I don't, because then they'll say the same thing.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And then I think for now, we will not introduce any alternative standards to the actual conflicting land use buffer, because that should be wrapped up into a conversation about parking maximums, maybe impervious surface limits, maybe just generalized planting requirements for climate change purposes. But it's more broad than just a vehicular use area, which I think is very, like, I still think this is a very successful discussion, because I wanted a sounding board for what are, I wanted this literal open-ended discussion without knowing for direction about which way it should go.
Well, if we solve for some of those other things that you just said, I mean, this would probably be worth revisiting, right? Because then,
Well, so maybe if we, yeah, I would say it's tackle a different question. And then the answer might be, oh, tinker with this too, because it's wrapped up, but attack it from the top down, not bottom up.
That sounds right to me.
Fantastic.
All right.
Deputy
Anything
Manager
else you're hoping
Kelly?
to get from us? Yeah.
No, not I. I think Deputy Manager Kelly, since I'm Planner DeLeo, Do we have any inkling for like next coming up proposed business, or not? Just to give a teaser, or no, we'll have to for the May meeting, or we'll do something else.
So for us to take this up at I think to properly notice for the May 16th meeting, we would have to have ordered postcards and mailed by this Friday.
No, I meant like for
Oh.
the May ORC meeting, do we have any idea of the agenda?
Okay.
The answer could be no.
I did have something earlier today and I was like, perfect. And now I can't remember it. And I was going to bring it up with you, but I will give you a preview for your June ORC meeting that we are hoping to make some changes to the UDC around traffic, traffic requirements and references to transportation needs and site plans in tandem with our transportation group. We're going to be working with some staff over there to clarify things because there's an updated version of the Institute of Transportation Engineers. ITE is the acronym. They have a new guide, and the UDC currently references the old one and says, or the update thereof. And we have to keep pointing people to the update thereof. So we want to clean that up. And we also just want to look for opportunities to make it easier to get what we want and move toward requiring what we want instead of asking and suggesting it. So I'm not sure exactly what form that'll take yet, but it's something that staff are looking forward to because it's a big part of projects and it's a big part of what you see at the table. So we'll get back to you on the May content.
That's
Having
fine.
a
I didn't
mind
need you to
blank
put,
right now.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, I will say that I think parking maximum, I mean, I know we have a work plan, so I don't know where parking maximums is on the work plan, and maybe it's not a 2023 item, but it does keep coming up. So if there was room to begin that conversation, which I think is really complex and will take us many, many conversations to get through, that would be something I personally would be in favor of beginning to talk about.
I will
But
say that
I know there's a plan.
Yeah. We are keeping the work plan in mind. We're also being sensitive to some other projects that are on the work plan, but are kind of whales. So TC1 premiums, these are things that all share the same staff with ORC. And you're looking at her, Ms. DeLeo is our go-to for a lot of this work. And so with some retiring staff, it is becoming harder to assign site plans to everyone. And so it's taking on something that would be a much larger and multi meeting conversation like parking maximums. We could start it now, but if you also want to make things you can have discrete progress in, like these amendments can be made and they'll improve people's lives and you'll see it at the table very quickly. So that's kind of just behind the screen. That's what we're thinking about. I'll just, to just be perfectly honest, Planner DeLeo is doing an excellent job with a lot of projects right now. So we could think about parking maximums, but I wouldn't definitively say like, yes, let's take that up. I would want to think about it.
I think that makes sense. I totally hear that and understand. I wonder if there's value in, I'm open to the answer to this question being no. Like, is there value in open conversation that doesn't require a lot of preparation? Or where like the homework is being done by us to like read some things and then discuss it, or like look at a case study, or and it could be that we'll just waste time and talk in circles unless we've have the preparation and a presentation and all the work that you all do behind the scenes. So yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's worth thinking about whether it would be valuable for us to just have some time to talk openly if there's not time for it to be more structured. Just something to think about.
Yeah,
So,
we could consider that.
be happy to
but
do
I know we have a
research.
lot of whales. I know we have a lot of big ones on the plate. What's that?
I'd be happy to do research on like other cities' parking maximums if we each like took a couple and just brought it back to a meeting or something. Like we can do stuff, guys. We can help you.
What if we made a
What-
PowerPoint and presented it to you?
Yeah, what if we took this on in all of our spare time?
Well, that's an intriguing thought. Because I think with parking maximums, this is not a, I don't think the question is so much, should we? I think the community, the powers that be, is desiring that. So now it's a question of how should we? Are there, how do other people do it? What are the nuts and bolts? And so because it's a different question. I don't think that you're desiring a robust debate of should we or should we not institute parking maximums, but more like the more nitty gritty, like who does it and how do they do it? And do we like their models? Do they just limit the number? How do they work the mechanics of that?
Yeah. Okay. In the
Let us
interest
think
of
about
everyone,
it and we'll,
yeah.
to be continued.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next on the agenda, communication. I don't believe we received any communication to this committee. And then now our final opportunity for public comment. So if you'd like to address the committee, you can use the raise hand button if you're joining via Zoom, or if you're joining on the phone, you can press *9 to indicate a desire to address the committee. You'll be identified by your name or the last 3 digits of your phone number, and your comments will be limited to 3 minutes per speaker. I'm stalling a little bit here. Oh no, there's no delay. We're not televised. Okay, so Mix Kelly, do you see any speakers for public comment?
I do not.
Well then, we're on to our final item, which is adjournment, and I think we don't have to take a vote. So thanks all. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.
Bye.